What I want to talk about in this video is the relationship between war and peace. Now, the problem today, in my view, is that in the West, since the Enlightenment, we viewed these two as binaries. There's war and there's peace. And we see peace as the normal condition of mankind. And war is an anomaly. It's like something that breaks out periodically. You have to understand that that way of thinking is purely a European invention, what Michael Howard called in his book The Invention of Peace, that this concept of peace as being the normal condition of mankind was only constructed by the Europeans in the 1600s and the 1700s in the wake of the 30 Years' War, which was a horribly destructive and useless war. It solved nothing. Went on for 30 years and millions died. Central Europe was depopulated. In response to that, the Europeans tried to come up with ways to limit the destructiveness of war with laws, with regulations, with maritime changes and war and laws and legal concepts and all this other stuff. All these treatises that were written. But what you have to understand is before this period, and in many other places in the world that aren't driven by European Enlightenment thinking, like the Islamic world, where the jihadists draw their ideas about the relationship of war and peace not from 18th century Enlightenment thinking of intellectuals, but out of a Quran, or at least the interpretations of a Quran by the people whom they follow. And of course, before the 16th and 1700s, nobody thought of war and peace that way. The Europeans, the Christians, didn't think of war and peace that way. You talk about the Christian view of war and peace, think of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. You got disease, you got famine, you've got internal conflict, civil war, and you've got conquest, external conflict. Two out of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which periodically sweep through the world and kill people, are related to war. 2 out of the 4. That's their concept. That war is something that's going on all the time, and periodically peace breaks out. And what we've done in the modern world is turn that on its head, which is good. I mean, it's a good thing to want to have more peace rather than war. I'm not arguing it's not. But we've turned the reality of 600 years of history on its head, and then convinced ourselves that this is reality, when even in other places around the world. I mean, it's one of the reasons we have problems with the Islamic world today is that they didn't come through the same process as us. They don't share necessarily all the same ideals as us, especially when it comes to concepts of war and peace, combatants and non-combatants and all this stuff. But we've convinced ourselves that this is reality. This is the way it is. This is the way it must have always been, but it hasn't been. It's only been like this for 400 years in Europe. And the rest of the world and the rest of the 6,000 years of recorded history, forget it. Just ignore all that. And basically, we're in a stupid position. And because of that, we don't understand how things work. I see comments sometimes on Facebook, oh, Trump's going to bring us to war, or Obama's going to get us into a war, or Bush is going to get us into a war. We're never, it's like health and sickness. It's not a binary. You're not, you're healthy or you're sick. It's not like that. I mean, everybody's one day closer to death every day. And some people, I saw a video of a young woman who survived cancer, bone marrow transplant. She survived, but she realized after that people kept treating her like she was healthy, but she's not. She's cured of cancer. In that sense, she's healthy, but she still has fatigue, and she still has pains, and she still has residual problems that will she'll have to deal with the rest of her life. And she realized that, it's not, you're not either healthy or sick. You're somewhere in between. It's not a binary. It's just this spectrum of health/disease that you're on. Some people are more to the health side. Some people are more toward death. But it's the same with war and peace. You're never in a state of war, and you're never in a state of peace. You're somewhere in between. You can lean more toward the war side, where things really break out and get hot, or you can lean more toward the peace side. But I mean, let's be real. We are at war with Russia today. I mean, we're not blowing each other up, but we've been at war with Russia pretty much since about 1946. Some people would argue 1917. I mean, there's a period there when they collapsed, that they weren't a threat to anybody, that things got pretty peaceful. But now, as they've gradually started to bounce back to some degree, not to the extent that they had been a threat before, they threaten our policies. They're giving us a hard time in Venezuela. They give us a hard time in Cuba. They're giving us a hard time in some places in Africa. They're giving us a hard time in the Middle East, in Syria, with Iran and stuff like that. It's the same with China. We are at war with China. I mean, if you look at the spectrum of peace and conflict, okay, we're not having a conflict, but we're not at peace with China. I mean, we've got a trade war. They're doing things in East Asia that we don't like. We're doing things they don't like. We got problems with them, in any number of other places around the globe. And it's just like moving a counter back and forth on this spectrum. But there are a lot of people in the West who think that it's either one or the other. You conduct diplomacy absent of any threats of war or concept of war. I remember it was back in the Clinton days when I forget who his Secretary of State was. He said that they had actually got somebody to come to an agreement. I think it was the Yugoslavs, the Serbs. And he was, crowing that, one of the ways we got the Serbs to agree to this was the threat that we'd continue bombing them and possibly even send ground troops in, because we had moved ground troops into Macedonia. And, here's a guy who's Secretary of State who's astounded at the idea that there might be some sort of link between the threat of war and diplomacy. The founders would have been blown away by that. Like, what an idiot. I mean, it's on the Great Seal of the United States, which, if you don't know what it looks like, it's on the back of a dollar bill. What's the eagle have? He has 13 arrows, 13, one for each state, in his one talon. And he's got an olive branch with 13 leaves in the other. And that's the whole idea. Do you want peace or war? We're ready to negotiate. We're ready to fight. I mean, the founders' view was that's how you went about diplomacy. You went about diplomacy, with war, the possibility of outright war in the background. Likewise, you went about war with diplomacy going on at the same time. So before we were at war with the French during the Quasi-War, we were negotiating with them, and we were threatening them. And then when they kept giving us a hard time, we actually went to an unlimited war with them. It wasn't a full-out war. It was the first war fought under the Constitution, and it was undeclared. Right from the start. Our second war was undeclared, too. But soon as they started fighting the French, what did they do? John Adams sent negotiators back to France to see if he could get a deal. Of course, this time dealing with the French, knowing that we were, taking action against them in the Caribbean and threatening them elsewhere. We were talking about putting ships into the Mediterranean. We actually sent some out as far as Indonesia, into the Indian Ocean. So the French cut a deal because they thought they could push us around and we wouldn't do anything, and then when we did, they negotiated. But Adams never went, all-out war or all-out peace. He was always operating in between, and that's how these things, work best together. And most of the founders, whether they were Federalists or Republicans, Democratic Republicans, knew how to do the same thing. Jefferson was good at that. I mean, Jefferson wanted to buy New Orleans, and they threatened that, well, maybe if you don't sell it to us, we'll invade it. So guess what? They sold Louisiana to the Americans. And later on, we did the same with Spain and Florida. We tried to do the same with Texas and California with Mexico. We made them an offer. They refused it. We went to war. We made them the same offer, and they accepted it. So there's not this dichotomy, this binary between you get war here and peace here. That's not how it works. And it's only since the Enlightenment that we've been trying to convince ourselves, and I see it in the students I get into my military history classes. That's how they see this. There's peace. And then the question is, why did war break out? And that's the wrong question. You know, there's never peace. There's always confrontation brewing. And the question is, why was diplomacy unable to keep it from getting worse? Instead, the situation deteriorated, and you end up in some level of warfare. The entire spectrum of warfare could be a full-blown war like World War II. It could be a more limited war like Korea, or an even more limited war like the war of a quasi-war with France, where we only use naval forces. Or it could be a war where you're using mercenaries or proxies to do your fighting for you, as we and the Soviets often did during the Cold War. So that the reality is that there's not a situation where you have, you know, peace and war. That doesn't exist. And this idea that peace is the reality, I would argue, and as Michael Howard's argued, is a European invention from the 18th century. And that's it. You've got 6,000 years of recorded history. We've only thought like that for the last 300 to 400 years. And even at that, large parts of the rest of the world don't think that way. So basically what we're living in is a bubble, a dream world that we live in and other people don't. And that's a problem for our policymakers, it's a problem for the public, it's a problem for the media, because they don't understand it. You can't understand what's going on, for example, between the West and the jihadists, the war on terror, whatever you want to call it, overseas contingency operations, as Obama termed it. You can't understand that unless you understand that, you know, our concepts of relationship between war and peace are very different than theirs. Ours are based on Enlightenment thinking. Theirs are based on a 7th century religious document. You know, we talk about combatants and non-combatants. They define people on the battlefield not as combatants and non-combatants, but as Muslims and non-Muslims. You know, they're not bound by the things Dutch jurists wrote in the 1600s or the 1700s, or the French philosophers wrote in the 1800s. You know, they're reading the Quran, and that's, you know, and that's how they define things on the battlefield. You're a Muslim, you're a non-Muslim. We're talking combatants and non-combatants, and that's why we have so many problems. That's why people can't understand what's going on. Why did they do these things? It's because they don't think like you. They don't think that there's peace. You know, in their view, war is a constant until such time as Islam rules the world. When the whole world is governed by Islamic law, you know, laws come from the lawgiver, and the lawgiver is Allah. It's not a legislative branch. It's not a Senate. It's not a House. It's not an elected official. Laws come from Allah. People, religious leaders, scholars, interpret Allah's known writings and the things he said to Muhammad, and the things Muhammad did that Allah approved of, and from that garner out what they think law should be. That's Sharia. And basically the Islamic view is that when all the laws, when the entire world is ruled by Sharia, there will be peace. But until such time, you have the Islamic world, the Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, where Islam rules. And everything else is in the Dar al-Harb, the abode of the Harbis, the abode of Harbis, basically war. We live in the house of war. So they don't see this thing as war or peace. As long as we're here, there's a war. That doesn't mean that they have to attack. It doesn't mean they have to do anything. But actually, under Islamic tradition, if they're not invading us, they need to raid us, and they need to get us into a position where we're willing to pay tribute. That's the traditional way that they operate. So that means raiding is good. If people aren't paying you money to behave, then you can kill them. You can seize those ships in the Mediterranean, like happened to us in the late 1700s, early 1800s. You can blow stuff up. You can take prisoners. You can do all these things. Perfectly permissible until such time as we either incorporate Sharia law ourselves, adopt Islam, or start paying them to leave us alone, pay tribute. Barbary states, I think that's why we had to pay them tribute. And their concepts of war and peace are entirely different than ours. And their definitions, like I said, of combatants and non-combatants are entirely different than ours. We're playing by one set of rules, they're playing by another. We're not even talking the same language. They're talking a pre-Enlightenment language. It would have been understood by Christians back in the 1500s or 1400s. But it's incomprehensible to students today. And I see them come into my classes and they just don't get it. They don't understand. To them, they've been so indoctrinated with this idea that peace is the normal condition of man and wars break out, that they can't comprehend how anybody else is doing anything that they're doing, given that must be how they think. It's just incomprehensible to them. But they don't realize that they're thinking of the relationship between war and peace, as I said, is a very recent, in historical terms, European construct. That's all it is. It's not some God-given view that's been around for 2,000 years or something. It's a 300 to 400-year-old European construct that never was embraced by the entire planet anyway. And that's what we have to deal with today. And you can't deal with it. One of the first things I have to do in my classes is try to explain to my students that this is the reality, that they don't live in the reality. They're ignoring the reality. They've been brought up in a bubble. And what they need to do is to look outside that bubble and understand how the world for the last 6,000 years has worked and how large parts of it today still function.